Thank you again for joining us for the talk, Visualizing Banaras, Architectural Symbolism in the Golden Illustrated Ramayana by Professor Heeryoon Shin. We're delighted to be launching the publication, Book of Gold, the Kanchana Chitra Ramayana of Banaras, with this illustrated lecture. Heeryoon contributed an essay situating the importance of the architectural world of Kashi within the manuscript. Taking from the essay, she will delve into the built context of the Kanchana Chitra Ramayana and the creation of a new sacred landscape through architecture by the Narayan dynasty of Banaras. Heeryoon will look at how these endeavors added to the building boom in Banaras and helped in carving out a distinct identity for this newly established royal line. Few copies of the book are available for sale right outside the auditorium for those interested to picking one up. A little bit about Heeryoon. She's an assistant professor of art history and visual culture at Bard College, where she teaches courses on South and East Asian art. Her current project explores the architectural revival, mobility, and cross-cultural exchange in early colonial India through the lens of temple architecture in the pilgrimage city of Banaras, a portion of which has been published in Artibus Asia and Journal 18. Her other project is on the global circulation of blue and white ceramics and their interaction with local production and use in South Asia. Before I hand over to Heeryoon, I would like to thank Priyanka from Signable, who will be your Indian Sign Language interpreter for the session. I would like to request everyone to turn off your phones or put them on silent, and also perhaps to come a little bit forward for better experience. Now over to Heeryoon.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Can you hear me? Better? Yes, okay. So thank you again for the wonderful introduction. I also have to apologize in advance that I'm recovering from a bad cold and my vocal cords are only half working. But it is such a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to express my deepest gratitude to everyone who was involved in the Book of Gold exhibition, and of course everyone at MAP for accommodating my visit and welcoming me yesterday and today. I was finally able to see the exhibition in person yesterday, and it was just mind-blowing, and I feel extremely lucky to be part of this wonderful project. So for me, this project started in the summer of 2021. I received an email from Kavita Singh. Is this better? So I received an email from Kavita Singh asking to chat about, and I quote, a potential small project. And I still remember the excitement after my first Zoom call with Kavita, not only because the lavish Kashi Ramcharitamanas, which I had only read about and seen in black and white copies, had become accessible, but also because it meant that I would be working with Kavita for the first time, a deeply admired mentor, colleague, and a dear friend whom I came to know when she was a fellow at the Clark Art Institute in 2015. So coming to see this exhibition is also my way of remembering and thanking Kavita, and I can only hope that I can do her proud. The manuscript pages that Kavita shared with me were absolutely thrilling. For the first time, albeit virtually, I was able to appreciate the monumental scope and details of the manuscript in full color at my own pace. And in the process, I noticed something that I had somehow completely missed when I was hastily going through the black and white copies at the American Institute of Indian Studies Library as a PhD student, the strong presence of architecture and the built environment in the paintings. Expensive fort palaces, multi-storied urban courtyard houses, and ornate temples appear folio after folio. Architecture plays multiple roles in bringing the manuscript's effects to full potential, as an effective framing device, as a marker of a prosperous kingdom and court, and perhaps most importantly for this talk, as a brilliant visual strategy that makes the mythical world of the Ramcharitamanas refreshingly present and connected to the world that the manuscript's patrons, artists, and audiences aspired for and occupied. In this representation of Ravana's golden palace in Lanka, layers and layers of arched colonnades in gold dramatically recede into space, as if suggesting an infinite expansion of inner courtyards and halls beyond the picture plane. But it's not just the dizzying space and shimmering gold that convey the grandeur of Ravana's palace. The painters also employ the widely shared language of contemporaneous courtly architecture that spread across northern India from the Mughal court from the late 17th century onwards. Cusped arches, ornately decorated with perfectly symmetrical floral and vegetal scrolls, baluster columns tapering upwards, bulbous domes, and curvaceous bangla roof framing the royal women. The contemporaneous architectural forms make the prestige and luxury of Ravana's palace immediately recognizable and identifiable to the early 19th century audience. So in this talk, I would like us to explore the Ramcharitamanas manuscript through the lens of architecture, not only its painted representations, but also the actual built environment of 18th and 19th century Benares and how they resonate with each other. In so doing, this talk also examines the Ramcharitamanas manuscript as part of an ambitious project by its patron, Raja Udit Narayan Singh, represented here with his own architectural backdrop of a baluster column in Benares' riverfront. The commissioning of the manuscript, architectural and landscaping practices, and the public performance of the Ramcharitamanas together recast the majestic fort, gardens, and temples in the royal capital of Ramnagar in a new sacred landscape centered on Rama. First, I'll begin with an overview of the architectural projects on the celebrated western bank of the Ganga, where the various emergent trans-regional Hindu rulers sought legitimacy by reconstructing a visible and tangible sacred landscape. I will then cross the river to Ramnagar, where the rising local Kashi dynasty, the patrons of our manuscript, vied for equivalent prestige and sanctity through the creation of a new sacred landscape and public performance. And finally, I will briefly situate the paintings in the larger context of representing Benares' built environment across various genres during this period, from pilgrimage maps to panoramic scrolls. And you will see that Udit Narayan Singh was not the only patron commissioning paintings that linked the physical space of Benares to the mythical and sacred. In addition to referencing contemporaneous architectural forms, some of the paintings in the manuscript even more specifically evoke Benares in the early 19th century. So here we see a magnificent city rising on one side of the river. The continuous stretch of imposing residences and temples stands in contrast with the forested wilderness across the river. The city not only boasts impressive architecture, but also bustling activities along the spacious promenade. The stone ghats leading to the river provide ample spaces for daily bathing and ablution rituals, while the numerous boats on the river suggest the city's connection to larger networks of travel and commerce. The painting represents the city of Ayodhya, but contemporary visitors to Benares would have witnessed a remarkably similar scene unfolding in front of them. In fact, the fortress-like facade of the riverfront residences and temples rising in between evoke Benares so closely that the painting seems to intentionally imply that Benares is equal to, if not greater than, Ayodhya. The visitors would have also recognized how new everything was, dated to no more than just a couple of decades before, or even more recent years, and many more structures would have been in progress. Benares had been long revered as a prestigious educational and religious center, In the 16th and 17th centuries, Mughal and Rajput nobles paid lavish attention to the city's monasteries, temples, and esteemed Brahmin teachers. So some of the imposing residential complexes built by prominent Rajput royal families from this period still survive on the riverfront. But from the second half of the 18th century onwards, an even bigger, unprecedented construction boom began to completely transform the city skyline. Multi-story temple and palace complexes rose side by side on the ghats along the Ganga, now refurbished in heavy, durable sandstone, not unlike our painting. These extensive building projects correspond to Banaras's newly found status as a major commercial and banking hub, in addition to an important pilgrimage center. The decentralization of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century gave rise to new interregional networks of trade and politics, and burgeoning regional rulers, merchants, and bankers. As you can see on the map, occupying a central spot on the trade route between the strongholds of the two rising powers of the time, Bengal, the center of the British East India Company, and the Maratha territories to the south, Benares became the largest urban center in the eastern Gangetic Plain during the second half of the 18th century. So you can imagine how attractive Benares would have been to the newly established power holders of this period. Many of these burgeoning rulers had emerged from humble beginnings and were eager to reinvent themselves as nobility with an ancient genealogy through cultural patronage. And whether they were local landholders or more powerful ruling families from afar, Benares held tremendous religious and economic value. When these patrons performed pilgrimages and built temple and palace complexes in the city, it could be seen by a broad trans-regional audience, not only including local residents of Benares, but all those who made the pilgrimage to the holy city. And I think this is what makes Banaras so unique. It's built by multiple patrons rather than a singular local dynasty. And you see it in the architecture as well. Some patrons prefer to employ the building style and materials that are more widely available in the Banaras area. For the temples of Ahilyabai Holkar, the pious queen of the Maratha Holkar dynasty, agents were dispatched from her capital in central India to hire local artisans and use local materials. But others brought their distinctive regional style and building methods. And although this is a bit later than the manuscript, the wood and brick Nepali temple, sponsored by the Nepalese royal family, is modeled after the Pashupatina temple in Kathmandu. And moreover, the sources for Benares' temples were not limited to just temple architecture. We even see temples incorporating British neoclassical forms, such as the Gurudam Temple, where a pedimented gateway greets the visitor. As architectural historian George Michel has noted, Benares may well be considered as an architectural depository of 18th and 19th century India. And in a way, I think it really parallels the different artist groups and painting styles seen in the Kashi Ramcharitamanas manuscript. Particularly dominant among the patrons from this period were the Maratha ruling families from central and southern India. So you're looking at all Maratha-sponsored ghats, residential complexes, and temples, which were filling up the northern stretch of the riverfront. Built alongside previous Rajput-sponsored structures on the riverfront, these new constructions not only established a visual link with more ancient Rajput ruling houses, but physically carved out a collective Maratha presence in a space previously occupied by the Rajputs and Mughals. Such concerted building activities on Benares' riverfront could have inspired the artists as the model of a prosperous city. Like the buildings in the painting, typical riverfront complexes in Benares feature a fortified design with solid, unadorned facade at the base, usually with a central gate providing access from the Ghat steps. And perhaps as a precautionary measure against the rising water levels, the building only opens up with windows and balconies on the upper floors, which is at the same level as the streets behind the riverfront. The upper terraces often contain temples, as seen in the example of the Bonslegat Palace, easily recognized even on the crowded riverfront, thanks to its distinctive multi-lobed corner towers. The northern area of the riverfront was also ideal for lucrative financial opportunities. And in fact, several of the prominent Maratha patrons were involved in banking firms with headquarters or branches in Benares. Behind the riverfront was a bustling market where banking firms served traders and pilgrims coming from afar, and Punjab shawls and Bengal silks were sold and shipped off to the Maratha centers in the Deccan. In Ayodhya under Rama's rule, the riverfront Ghat steps and platforms providing spaces of ritual lead to a busy bazaar street, densely packed with multi-purpose residential buildings whose ground floors have been converted into shops. The lively scene and multi-storied buildings evoke the streets of Chokamba, Benares' principal mercantile center, located just south of Manikarnika Ghat. The choice of building locations was also driven by a desire to create a new sacred landscape for Benares. Maratha ruling families and nobles rebuilt and renovated some of the most important pilgrimage sites that had fallen into disrepair. When new temples were built, their location and names were still often based on earlier pilgrimage texts and eulogies of Benares, promoted by influential Brahmins with ties to Maratha regions. The fact that many of these sites were left in a dilapidated state by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb would have provided an even stronger motivation. For the Hindu Marathas, whose expansion in central and North India collided with the Mughal Empire, reviving the sites destroyed by the Muslim Mughal emperor could satisfy both religious and political assertions of Maratha supremacy. As Madhuri Desai has shown, the patronage of temples, ghats, and other ritual infrastructures in 18th and 19th century Benares gave a tangible form to a prescribed and often imagined Hindu sacred topography. And in this reconstructed sacred landscape, Shiva reigned supreme. The dominant pilgrimage texts used for reference in reconstructing this sacred landscape heavily emphasize Shiva's ties to Benares. So at the center of the prescribed pilgrimage routes in this text was Vishvanatha as the city's principal linga. The present version of the Kashi Vishvanatha temple also dates to this period, built by the aforementioned Maratha queen Ahilyabai Holkar in 1781. The iteration that immediately preceded Ahilyabai's temple was built in 1585 under the collaborative efforts of the renowned Maratha Brahmin Narayana Bhatta and the Rajput noble and Mughal financial minister Raja Todar Mal. Once a grand structure befitting the high rank of its patron, the temple was torn down in 1669 under the orders of Aurangzeb. Ahilyabai's Vishvanatha temple, which stands adjacent to this earlier site, is representative of the selective revivalism seen in Benares' temples from this period. The temple is comprised of two square sanctums, joined by a dome square mandapa hall in the center. Crowning both sanctums is a tall curvilinear tower, or shikara, a style of temple superstructure that has been used in northern and central India from as early as the 6th century. The temple's ground plan, wall projections, and the projections on the temple superstructure correspond vertically with each other. The cluster form of the Vishwanatha temple shikaras, in particular, evokes a mode known as shekari, in which cascading projections of miniature half shikaras form a cluster tower. Built in large numbers across western, central, and northern India between the 8th and 10th centuries, shekari temples regained their popularity from the 18th century onwards. And the choice seems to deliberately evoke a pre-Mughal tradition, as shekari temples had not been continuously built in the Banaras region, and domed and vaulted temples from the 17th century were more easily available as existing models. But the temple is not a faithful replication of the medieval shekari temple either. A closer look reveals the incorporation of more recent forms. The fluted dome, for example, with an acanthus leaf decoration at the base, and a petaled finial on top, was shared across temples, tombs, and mosques. The pillars of the Vishwanatha temple also combine both old and new features. Whereas its angular shaft and a bell and chain motif adornment recall earlier architectural traditions, the large lotus petal motif with its blooming flowers seen on the base of the pillar was a more contemporary feature. The combination of a revivalist shikara on the sanctum and decorative details deriving from Mughal courtly architecture, especially in the mandapa area, is seen across other late 18th and early 19th century temples in Benares. So now when we come back to the Kashi Ramcharitamanas, we can see that many of the painted temples closely follow this new development in late 18th century temple architecture, which was one of the most exciting discoveries for me when I looked at the paintings. Such a temple occupies the center of Rama and Sita encounter each other in a garden. This painting depicts the fateful moment when Rama and Sita meet for the first time and fall in love in the royal garden of Janakpur, where Sita and her friends come to worship the goddess Girija Devi. The carefully delineated details from each half tower in the shikara to the decorative motif on the walls suggest that the artist drew upon their knowledge of an actual temple rather than after a generic type. So here too, while the shikara is clearly in the form of the revivalist shekari style, the cusped arch and baluster columns framing the goddess below show an engagement with contemporaneous courtly language. The painting also depicts a feature increasingly seen in temples from this period onwards. Unlike the Vishwanatha temple, the walls do not seem to have the deep projections that continue upwards, bearing no explicit connection with the shikara. The separation between the superstructure and the main level becomes more common in the 19th century, as the shekari superstructure is turned from a fully integrated architectural modal system into a more stylistic veneer. Instead, the flat walls below the shikara employ the ornamental details of Mughal courtly architecture. This new style of temple architecture seems to express the aspiration to appear rooted in an ancient Hindu tradition on one hand, yet remain as active participants in the wider contemporary courtly world on the other. Now, when we come back to this painting, you may have also noticed that the setting for the Girija Devi temple differs significantly from what I have shown you so far. The temple occupies a spacious walled compound with a blooming garden and a large stepped tank. Instead of multi-storied buildings and crowded bazaar streets, as you see in the right painting, outside the walls of the garden lie a lush forest filled with deep green trees and the songs of birds. To find such temple complexes, we need to leave the densely packed urban center and its labyrinthine alley, and cross the river to Ramnagar, to the suburbs. As the Marathas and other trans-regional patrons were busy transforming the urban and sacred landscape of Benares, another sacred landscape centered on Rama was emerging across the river in the town of Ramnagar in the early 19th century. Founded in 1765 as the capital of the local Banaras Rajas, Ramnagar is today best known for its Ram Lila, a 31-day public performance of the Ramcharitamanas, and you may have seen the video by Richard Schechner playing in the gallery. During those 31 days, makeshift and permanent architecture, renamed landscapes, and multisensory performances turned Ramnagar into a true city of Rama, one that rivals and even subverts the prestige of the city of Shiva across the river, as the flow of pilgrims is reversed, with crowds streaming across the bridges coming from Kashi to Ramnagar. So as we can see on this map, the architectural patronage of the Banaras Rajas in Ramnagar and the vicinities differ markedly from their urban counterparts across the river. Instead of rebuilding the famous pilgrimage temples close to the city's religious and commercial centers, the building projects of the Rajas were concentrated on the outskirts of the city or in the southern areas of the riverfront, away from the Maratha-dominated northern area. And in these suburban areas, where ample space was available compared to the densely packed urban core, the multi-story buildings that make room for temples on the rooftop courtyard, which we have seen on the Banaras side, gave way to spacious temple compounds boasting step tanks and leafy gardens, which is a more appropriate setting for the flowering gardens of Janakpur than the alleyways in the city. This concentration of building projects outside the city center, including Ramnagar, may have been a deliberate and strategic move for a newly established local dynasty. Like the majority of patrons in Benares during this period, the Rajas of Benares came from relatively humble beginnings. They were initially a family of Brahmin landowners from the Jaunpur district, working as tax collectors for the Nawab of Awadh, who had initial control over the Benares region. And as the Nawab's power weakened, a royal lineage of Banaras Rajas was eventually established, beginning with Balwant Singh, who acquired the title of Raja from the Mughal emperor in 1734. The power of the new Raja, the power of the new Raja particularly rested on the monetary and military support from local landholders, clan members, and merchants that allowed them to declare autonomy against the Nawab. The Raja's building projects were accordingly aimed at strengthening their political and military power in the eyes of local and regional audiences within their domain. The garden complexes in Bhairanath and Chakya, for example, doubled as hunting and pleasure retreats, but also as important military strongholds for the Rajas when the Nawab's army turned up to demand unpaid revenues. The new political base at Ramnagar Fort, which was built by Balwant Singh in 1756, stood at a riverfront location in a safe, but still close distance to the city of Benares. Although structures have been added and rebuilt over the centuries, it is not difficult to imagine the commanding presence that Balwant Singh's fort held in 1756. The fort follows the fortified structure of the typical Benares riverfront palace, which we have seen earlier, which consists of a massive solid base offering protection for the palace apartments standing at street level. In addition to the riverfront gateway, the palace is accessible from Ramnagar town through a multi-storied gateway on which court musicians would play ceremonial music and drums to announce the ruler's presence. Like the fort palace, the multi-storied gateway uses elements typical of court architecture of the period, also represented in the paintings. But there was a problem. The fortress's location on the opposite side of Benares city meant that Bawan Singh's capital lacked the sanctity of the city of Shiva across the Ganges. In contrast to the western bank, the eastern bank where Ramnagar was located was viewed as impure. In fact, so inauspicious that those who died on this side would be reborn as asses. To compensate, the Raja turned to the famous sage Vedavyasa in order to invest Ramnagar with a potent sacrality. According to the Kashikanda, the sage Vyasa was banished by Shiva from Benares for placing a curse on the city. Vyasa then took up residence on the other side of the river and established a new sacred center rivaling Kashi. Legend has it that the Ramnagar fort was built on the former residing place of Vyasa, and that Bawan Singh constructed his fort around the Shiva Linga consecrated by the sage himself. This legend also brought pilgrims to Ramnagar. In one version of the legend, Vyasa asked for a boon from Shiva, who granted a blessing that if people visit the temple of Vedavyasa in the month of Magh, so January and February, they would be exempt from the calamity of being reborn as asses after death. And Bawan Singh's strategy was successful. By the late 19th century, M.A. Schering was reporting that Ramnagar attracted pilgrims in great multitudes during those months, not only from Ramnagar, but also from the city of Benares across the river. The Vyasa temple, said to enshrine the very Shiva Linga consecrated by Vedavyasa, stands facing the river on the terrace of Ramnagar fort. The temple's architecture itself is a simple cubical structure with a bulbous white dome surrounded by 4 miniature chhatris. Preceding the selective revivalism seen in temples built from the late 18th century onward, this earlier temple's dome and flat walls with decorative arched niches evoke the forms of Mughal tombs. The domed cubical temple type would continue to inspire temples sponsored by the Rajas, even after temples with towering shikaras became more popular in Benares. Other surviving examples, however, were built mostly in the suburbs and forested areas, much like the painting of Sita's temple in Janapur. So one example here is found in the village of Berunath, just outside of Benares near Gangapur, Bawan Singh's initial home base. This Shiva temple was built in 1754, about the same time as the construction of Ramnagar fort and the Vyasa temple, as part of a larger complex that consists of a water tank and a walled garden. In Chakya, the site of military operation in the early days of Bawan Singh, and later the family's hunting retreat in a forested area, a Kali temple built by Raja Udit Narayan Singh is aligned with a stepped tank and a Mughal-style Charbagh garden residence along a north-south axis. The combination of a domed cubical temple and Charbagh garden could have evoked Mughal tomb gardens, whose form and symbolism of dynastic continuity and power had spread beyond geographical and religious boundaries by this time. The walled garden and the temple's ornamental details, such as cusped arches with a blooming flower at the center, baluster columns supporting curved bangla roofs, and geometric jali screens, further establish the Rajas of Benares as participants in the elite courtly culture shared across northern India, while the tank provides a public space of ritual and daily activities for the Raja's subjects. The garden, in particular, could satisfy multiple symbolic and practical purposes. Creating and enjoying a walled garden was an important part of the courtly life of the ruling elite, not only because of the activities of courtly leisure the garden provided, but also because of its potent political significance. In Rama, in Rama and Sita encounter each other in a garden. The garden arranges alternating flowering bushes, cypresses, and voluptuous fruit-bearing trees along concentric walkways. Compared to the unruly wilderness of surrounding forests, the walled garden is a carefully controlled and orderly domain, serving as a visual metaphor for territorial control and governance, a perfect place for the romance of an ideal king and his queen. The garden is also a site of multisensorial pleasures, filled with aromatic fragrance, the chirping of birds, and the gentle sound of running water, as you may have seen in the many pages of the Ramcharitamanas manuscript in the galleries. As the physical and sensual realization of prosperity and paradise, the garden could symbolize the good government and golden age brought by the king's just and wise rule. In Sanskrit courtly literature, it was not only the beautiful and fabulous plants, but also the sensorial practices enjoyed in the garden that transformed the king's abode into a wondrous place, like a house of God. And by the 1830s, a total of 174 gardens were reported in Benares, providing royal and divine pleasures to the city's urban elites. The distinctive combination of temple, tank, and walled garden would find the grandest example in Ramnagar under Bawan Singh's successor, Chet Singh, whose troubled reign began with a succession dispute over his status as an illegitimate son. Perhaps because of his unstable position within his own court, the new Raja actively engaged in highly visible public projects that could bolster his status in the eyes of both local and trans-regional audiences. On a strategic location at the intersection of the Chinar and the Grand Trunk roads, about 1.5 miles northwest from the fort, Chet Singh built a vast complex comprised of a walled garden, tank, and a monumental temple dedicated to the goddess Durga called the Sumeru Devi Temple. This new building project replicated Bawan Singh's temple and garden complex in format, but at an unprecedented scale, presenting the new Raja as not only the rightful heir to the dynasty, but also as one who could surpass his father. Both the vast scale of the project and its spatial configuration established the temple complex's central role in reaffirming the Raja's kingship. On the north-south axis, a massive walled Tarba garden and a stepped tank of the same size were built side by side. The royal temple stood at the eastern end of the tank so that the east-west axis of the tank would be aligned with the temple sanctum. And within the garden, a pavilion modeled after the Mughal Hall of Audience further created a visual hierarchy surrounding the Raja. If the garden emphasized the Raja's political authority in the worldly realm, the monumental temple and tank displayed his contribution to the divine. By placing the deity at the culminating end of the east-west axis of the tank, and the Raja at the north-south axis, all connected by a succession of steps, pavilions, and walkways, the design of the temple and garden complex elevated the Raja to a status equivalent with the divine. The Sumeru Devi Temple has a unique architectural style worth examining. It stands on a raised plinth and rises more than 10 meters high in a monumental scale befitting its namesake, the sacred mountain of Sumeru, that rises above the cosmic ocean. The temple itself is a simple, single-celled cubical structure, the square ground plan with 4 identical walls, recalling Bhawan Singh's Shiva temple. The superstructure, however, sets apart the Sumeru Devi temple from the earlier temple or any other temples in Benares. Each side of the angular pyramidal superstructure has 2 shallow projections that correspond to the wall projections in a simplified version of the shikara popular in Benares from this period. But this distinctive repetition of deeply molded horizontal tiers is not seen anywhere in the city. The wall elevation below, too, is in an unprecedented format, divided up in equal-sized rectangular relief panels with decorative borders. George Michel has suggested that the brick and terracotta temples of Bengal, as a likely source for this unique temple form, all be carved in local Chunar sandstone. Although the similarities in the horizontal molded bands and rectangular relief panels become even more persuasive when considering the temple's affiliation with the goddess, the motivation or process of transmission are still unclear. The next iteration of Chet Singh's temple, tank, and garden complex finally brings us to the production of the Ramcharitamanas manuscript. Embarking on a grand attempt to recreate a city of Rama befitting the royal capital's namesake, Chet Singh's successor, Udit Narayan Singh, began an extensive patronage of the Ramcharitamanas, as we all know. The cultivation of the Rama tradition allowed the Raja's Banaras royal legitimacy not only in the eyes of the local landholders, merchants, and clan members, but also in the trans-regional audience and increasingly in the eyes of the British authorities who now officially controlled Benares and left visual and written accounts of their own. So by the late 19th century, we actually have British historians saying that the Banaras dynasty is indeed very ancient and not from the 18th century. If the lavishly illustrated Ramcharitamanas, with over 500 illustrated folios, made the Raja's vision and aspiration available to an elite courtly audience, its performance, the Ramnagar Ramlila, transformed the worldly realm of the Raja into the mythical realm of Rama in the eyes of a larger public. Under Udit Narayan Singh, both the natural landscape and the existing built environment at Ramnagar were deployed in this creation of Ramnagar as a city at once royal and divine. As Richard Schechner has shown, the geography of the Ramcharitamanas was mapped onto the built and natural environment of Ramnagar in accordance with the actual geographical configuration in the map of India. Nameless lakes, ponds were renamed, and transformed to the holy Ganga and Yamuna rivers, and an empty field into the battleground where Rama defeated the demon king Ravana. New structures were also added, including the Girija Devi temple in the newly named neighborhood of Janakpur. The single-cell temple topped with a shikara, directly aligned with the step tank in front, bears a remarkable resemblance to the painting in the Ramcharitamanas manuscript. Chet Singh's royal garden, renamed Rambagh, and the temple and tank would serve as key stages during the Ramlila performances along with the Ramnagar fort. For instance, on the first day of the Ramnagar Ramlila, the tank stands for the cosmic ocean, on which sleeping Vishnu floats on the serpent Ananta, when Brahma and Shiva approach him to ask for his help in punishing Ravana. Even the sculptural program of the temple may play a role. It may not be a coincidence that the same imagery of sleeping Vishnu is carved on the western wall of the temple, the side that faces the tank. When Ravana and his party moved from Chitrakoot to the Dandaka forest, they walked around the tank to meet with the god Indra in front of the Sumeru Devi temple. And on the final day of the performance, the closed gates of the Rambagh opens up to reveal its marble pavilion as the place where Rama expounded his teachings to the sage Sanaka and his 3 brothers, just like a guru teaching his disciples. In turn, Ramnagar fort became the background setting for Ayodhya, Rama's kingdom. If the Rambagh area became the setting for Rama's ascetic life, the fort was where Rama spent his life as a king, from his marriage to Sita to his victorious return and coronation. The boundaries between the legendary Ayodhya and Ramnagar are further dissolved on the day of Rama's coronation, when the Raja of Banaras himself sits as a dignified royal guest to the coronation ceremony. The transformation of the Raja's royal realm into the divine finds yet another resonance in one of the relief panels on the Sumeru Devi temple. Located on the second top row of the eastern wall, the panel depicts a 4-armed Indra riding on an elephant, heading towards a fort palace with domed pavilions, cusped arches, and a curved bangla roof by the river. In other words, a structure that looks remarkably similar to Ramnagar fort. So does the panel deliberately conflate the god with the Raja of Benares, transforming the king into a sanctified being? This is certainly the popular understanding of the image today. Many visitors to the temple identify the figure as the Raja of Benares and the fort as Ramnagar fort. A similar merging takes place in the concluding pages of the Ramcharitamanas manuscript. In Blessed is the Land Where the Sacred River Flows, the second to last page of the manuscript, Shiva narrates vignettes of a blessed city. In the opulent residences and temples, decked in rich textiles, in red and gold, Brahmins are in worship, giving lectures to a devoted audience. Families live in harmony, each doing their duty, and wealthy patrons selflessly donate their money to the poor. In the top right corner, located diagonally from Shiva and Parvati, a wise and just king holds court. So again, could this king refer to the Raja of Benares? We find a more explicit clue above the court and across the swirling current of the Ganga, an expensive waterfront fort palace built in golden sandstone. The cylindrical turrets along the solid walls and steps providing direct access to the river bear a strong resemblance to Ramnagar fort. Such insertion of identifiable architectural and topographic features into a mythical landscape allows us to situate the manuscript in the larger context of contemporaneous pictorial genres that also turn to Banaras's built environment for inspiration. And this is slightly outside the scope of this talk, and I will be very brief and somewhat rushed, but this is where I want to take the manuscript in the next steps, thinking about these paintings in terms of how place is represented in the late 18th century. The production of the Kashi Ramcharitamanas coincides with the period when Benares was extensively represented on paper and cloth for wider circulation, both by Indian and European artists, who may have even seen or worked on the manuscript. The newly built temples, ghats, and palaces on the riverfront unfold before our eyes in painted panoramas. The same structures appear in British picturesque landscape prints, although the toned-down color palette presents them in a more romanticized, nostalgic light. The riverfront buildings, again, make their appearance in painted pilgrimage maps. Placed in the actual geographical order from the south to north, The building-specific architectural features transform a generic scene that could be applied to any riverside city to 19th century Benares. And the praise of Benares as a prosperous and pious city also finds its parallel in contemporaneous Jain invitation scrolls, which are typically sent by a community or a town to invite a Jain monk to spend the 4 months of the rainy season with them. To entice the monk to accept the invitation, the paintings illustrate the town's attractiveness through bustling markets, famous temples, and lavish royal processions, much like the scenes in the Ramcharitamanas manuscript. And in fact, it is a monumental mural painting inside a Jain temple in Benares, roughly from the same period as the Kashi Ramcharitamanas manuscript, that most strongly resonates with Udit Narayan Singh's project. And although I don't have time to go into the details, familiar details and themes emerge as the mural overlays the mythical time and space of the Jina Parshvanatha's life on the urban space of early 19th century Benares. The birth of Parshvanatha, for example, takes place in a courtly architectural setting, not unlike Udit Narayan Singh's court at Ramnagar fort. And Parshvanatha rescues a snake from the ascetic Kamata's fire ritual in the backdrop of imposing riverfront palaces and busy bazaar streets of Benares. Through this creation of a visionary geography, the Jain community could reimagine Benares as a sacred Jain realm with not Rama or Shiva, but the Jina Parshvanatha at its center. The Kashi Ramcharitamanas, then, is also the patron's claim to the divine and worldly importance of Ramnagar. By bringing together the mythical with the physical space, the paintings effectively turn 19th century Ramnagar into a true tirtha, a crossing place where the mundane meets the sacred. So the final folio, or the second to the final folio, thus brings an apt conclusion to the Ramcharitamanas manuscript, which is not only the celebration of Rama's story, but also of Ramnagar and its rulers. Udit Narayan Singh, the patron of this magnificent manuscript, has brought Ram Rajya to his kingdom. Thank you. I apologize again for my voice. Thank you for the question. That's a great question that I hadn't really thought about, but now that I think of it, I think I mentioned that this is intended for an elite, a smaller group of audience. But now thinking about your question, this must have been. It's not just the Raja, right? This is such a collective project that involves multiple levels of artists and scribes and perhaps the priest who might be orally explaining these to the artists. So I wonder if we could think about this project as not just, as I have just argued, not just creating the sacred landscape, but also bringing the kingdom together. And maybe it's something, maybe the intended audience may have been small, but the project itself is very expensive. Within this manuscript?
Within this manuscript, yes.
Not really. The temples I have shown, I can't explain it, but when I saw these paintings, I immediately identified them as something that I would see in late 18th and 19th century Benares. And there are some temples represented within the paintings that look more generic and to me look more archaic. Wait, can you?
In the Jaipur style of painting, you must have noticed there are these conical hut-like structures, the summer haveli kind of structures, which are very typically, from Jaipur, and one doesn't really see them in the Lucknow or Banaras area. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, and it's a question that I would like to think further about because until I saw this exhibition, I wasn't very aware of the different painting styles or where they came from. So this is again, in the next steps. But thank you so much for the question. That's an excellent question.
It's not, in response to your question, I think it's not just the buildings, but there are many. So if you look at the painting of Dashrath's death, there's a flag painted there, which is actually the Jaipur flag. And it's possibly the artist was told to paint a flag, and the only flag he knew was the Jaipur flag, although Jaipur had nothing to do with Dashrath's death. So there are many such things that feature in that.
And if you and if you think about this, it's not just Benares that's being represented as in these multiple pictorial genres I have shown through references to its specific sites and geography and architecture. I mean, Jaipur is being represented in their own pilgrimage maps or in their paintings, for example. So that's a really great direction to take this project. Thank you.